Now, are we treating the elderly like a crazy old people's club? Not my words, but they're the words of former government advisor Joan Bakewell, who's tired of the over-70s being singled out during the coronavirus crisis. She's not alone. A group of senior doctors have warned against a blanket lockdown for all over 70s, which could be damaging for their mental health. As it stands, the government strongly advises that all over 70s follow social distancing measures and stay at home where possible, classing them as clinically vulnerable, irrespective of their health. But the BMA and the Royal College of GPs have said that age alone should not determine someone's ability to go about their everyday lives when the government begins easing the restrictions. Let's speak to former Pensions Minister Baroness Ros Altmann. Ros, afternoon to you. Do you have a sympathy with Joan Bakewell's point on this?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we don't allow normally discrimination in our country. It's meant to be illegal. And if you are having different rules for a particular group of people that restricts their freedom in the ways that you haven't restricted other people's freedom, then surely that is discriminatory. And there are fundamental freedoms that we're supposed to have in this country. The freedom to go about your daily life, to go out of your house. And of course, in an emergency lockdown, everybody is asked to stay home. And as you were just saying now, you know, people who flout the rules expect to be fined by the police or sanctioned in some way, but not if the rules don't apply to everybody the same.
But isn't it right that even if you are fit and healthy and you go out running every day, you're 75 or you're on your bike, whatever it is you do, you are still, whether you like it or not, you're still part of a vulnerable group.
On what basis? I mean, even the BMA is saying that you're vulnerable to other illnesses, but not COVID. And that's the issue here. You know, in a misguided attempt to supposedly protect people from COVID, you may well make them more likely to die of something else. And at the same time, you are undermining the liberty and freedom that we fought for in so many wars. You know, are we a free nation or are we a nation whose government determines what personal freedom each individual type group is allowed? And
well, the government may well say, Ros, but they might say, well, hang on, during a pandemic, yeah, the government do have to make those decisions.
They have to make it fairly, not discriminatory. You know, let's say there was a blanket ban on BAME people leaving their homes. That'd be outrage. Only the whites are allowed to leave. Everybody else must be locked up. Well, they are more vulnerable to this particular illness than other groups. So far as we know, and we don't know a lot about it, that's what we have already seen. Men are more vulnerable than women. Okay, so men stay locked up for much longer and women are allowed to go out. It doesn't make normal common sense.
But is it because...
And that's the problem here.
I think
what we're trying to do.
No, I hear it. I hear what you're saying, Ros, and I think most people do. And we know that you can be a fighting fit 70-year-old and be healthier than a 40-year-old who, you know, stuffs burgers and has never been for a run. We get all of that. However, the government have got to make a kind of call on this, haven't they? They've got to say, well, sort of on balance. It's that on balance, because otherwise we're going to we'll be knocking on doors going, OK, let's do your pulse rate. Let's see how many miles do you run. It would be an administrative nightmare to try and work this one out. So the easiest way, they've said, is on balance. And, you know, they are careful to a degree about the terminology they use because they've suggested that they strongly advise rather than insist. So on balance, that is the group that's probably best to stay indoors.
Strong advice is different from enforcement and fines if you don't follow this so-called advice, because then it becomes an instruction or an order. And that's what you expect from an authoritarian regime, but not from a democracy.
Yeah, but in
normal
times.
This is the problem that I have.
Aren't you missing the point, Ros? It's not normal times, is it?
But that means it should be not normal times for everybody.
But this is, on balance, a very vulnerable group. Probably the most vulnerable group, on balance, would be the over 70s. Would you agree with that?
Again, you say probably. And it's,
well, I'm not a clinician, so I'm going to take an educational guess that the answer is, by any measure, the over 70s are probably more vulnerable than the under 50s.
No, the over 70s as a group will not be more vulnerable than the over 50s who have health issues like lung problems.
Yes, but on balance, it's on balance, isn't it? You must get that, Ros, on balance.
But you're not balanced then. Because
if you're looking at a random group, okay, give me 150-year-olds and 170-year-olds. On balance, the 70-year-olds will be less healthy than the 50-year-olds. Fair enough?
But not necessarily less susceptible to dying from COVID.
But on balance, well, you could have people within the other group. I get that.
You're being biased there.
No, I'm being listen, I don't want to lock old people up. Why would I? I mean, it's a lovely thought. But I mean, we have to also be realistic, don't we? And say, yeah, you are likely once you hit there is such a thing as the aging process here, Ros Altmann. Come on.
Exactly. And that's what we've confused with all these so-called scientific studies. The probability of dying of anything as you get older is higher than if you're younger.
But if you have respiratory issues...
that people are missing. You know, whatever illness happened, an older person is more likely to die than the young, but maybe not of that particular thing. And that's the problem. You know, the so-called science doesn't fit with the medicine. The medical advice from the BMA is that actually you shouldn't isolate over 70s or any age group more than another one. On the medical grounds, actually, they could be more at risk from lockdown than they are from COVID.
Yeah,
Each individual. Do we trust people to know how to live or not? Yeah, are we in a police state where the police...
I'm not sure the BMA have got this right, Ros. I'm not sure that you've got this right, or the BMA for that matter.
On what basis do you think we should chuck away all our rules of freedom and liberty to lock up groups of people...
Ross, there's a global pandemic going on. There's a global pandemic. You're aware of that. Come on.
That's why everybody's being treated the same. But you can't say to an older person who you don't know, because you're old, we're going to lock you up. We're not going to give you the freedom to choose whether you are one of the people who are not vulnerable. We are going to give the freedom to a 50-year-old with COPD to do that, but we're not going to...
If I look at all the statistics of people who sadly died with COVID-19, then I will find a huge section of people in the over 70s and 80s. That's the reality.
You'll find that for any illness. That doesn't prove that COVID-19 is something that they need specifically protecting against because of their age. So, to them, they're not stupid.
Okay,
you know,
but it's not because of their age, it's because what the age brings with it. It's not about stupidity, is it? It's about saying, look, if a disproportionate amount of people who have died are over the age of 70 and even more so over the age of 80, then on balance, the government has to look at that and say, okay, in that case, we're going to advise, not insist, but advise for your own health, that there is it doesn't mean...
I have no problem with advising, but you're not talking about that.
Implicit within the advice is not that clearly everybody is going to get it, because your underlying health issue might be that you've got a bad shin or something and probably doesn't make you more vulnerable to it. Largely it's respiratory diseases we're talking about, but again, on balance, more people in that group would have those respiratory issues.
And you're now talking about something completely different. I have absolutely no problem with advice, strong advice, information and helping people recognise and understand the risks. What I have a real problem with is, regardless of whether they are at risk individually or not, ordering them, like a police state, to stay at home. If it's just advice and there's no penalty for those who desperately need to get out for their own physical and mental well-being, and they should be trusted to be wise enough to know that, just as we trust other age groups to do so, that's fine. That's what our responsible society is like. But if the government says, regardless of who you are, we care not about your personal freedom, we order you to stay at home, even if it's going to kill you. Because for many people, it will be fatal.